Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of No One's a Critic. I'm Kino, joined as always by Mac, and I have to say, you're looking very, very sweet today, bro. You got some drip on there.
I know. See this shit? Look at this.
These fucking shirts. Let me move my mic real quick so you can see. But these shirts are available now on. I'm gonna link to the Teespring store in the pinned comment of this video. But if you guys want your own official No One's a Critic merchandise, go get it there. How is this shirt for you? Do you like it?
I don't know. This is Teespring, you said?
Teespring, yep.
Okay, I actually like the feel of it. There's some because like I get a lot of I'll like order a shirt off Amazon or something, and sometimes I don't know if it's like the material or the fit just doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
These actually feel very comfy. I like these.
Yeah. Good. I picked the highest quality blend they had there, like the highest. I think it's ring sprung cotton or something. I don't know the exact
Ooh,
wording or whatever, but it's the fanciest one there. So if you guys
fancy.
want some official No One's a Critic drip, you want to support the podcast, we finally have merchandise. So that's awesome. And what a great episode to debut these onto, because I feel like this is going to be one of the most interesting episodes we've done so far, because in this episode we're going to be talking some shit slash defending two very popular franchises here. For context, we've been talking about this a little bit off stream here and there, but Mac recently watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he has some controversial thoughts. And I recently watched the Dune duology, and I have some controversial thoughts.
Duology,
So
I like that. Yeah.
we're gonna get into it today.
Yes, and believe we're gonna start off with Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, let's I want you to take the lead on this one, because you're new to the series and you have the controversial thoughts about this one. And but before we get into it, I want to set some ground rules that for both of these things, I think we could both agree that the defense it's in the book is not valid, right? Like, we don't give a shit.
Absolutely, I
Yeah, we don't
agree.
give a shit about that.
It's funny because, and like we'll get to it when we talk about Dune. I There are certain things that are explained in the Dune books,
Yeah,
but I never use that as an argument. I think it's a
yeah,
stupid fucking argument. I
yeah,
hate that argument.
yeah. It's an adaptation. Like, it has to stand on its own. I mean, there is some validity, I think, in some things like that, but I think in general we both agree that, like,
In general,
any criticism we have of the film exists for the film itself, and it has to stand on its own as part of its own medium. So that won't be present in our arguments here. But setting that aside, why don't you take the lead and kind of tell us your experience watching the Lord of the Rings for the first time?
so I actually did watch them. I don't remember watching them, but I remember watching them. I went to like a movie night with my friends in high school, and I think I
Mm.
fell asleep during like halfway through the
Okay,
fellowship.
but movie nights, by the way, are a terrible way to view any film, because you're not really watching a movie. You're hanging out, you're
Yeah,
playing games, you might be drinking if you're that age or whatever. But I recently watched American Fiction with my friends at a movie
ooh,
night.
good movie. I
Good
like that one.
movie, good movie, but not a good experience to watch with friends. It's like not an entertaining film. Like, if you watch it with friends, watch like Avengers or something. Don't watch something
Yeah,
complicated.
it's they're
It's not a good
funny.
experience.
They're fun, unless like you have like other like cinephile friends who are like gonna be like, okay, we'll watch it. Yeah, like something like a comedy or a shitty rom com, like those are fun. But I agree. Oh yeah, so and it wasn't that like I had a bad experience with them way back then. But I just never got around to watching them, and a lot of people have been very like surprised. They're like, wow, really? You haven't seen Lord of the Rings? I will, as a disclaimer, I will say that like high fantasy and to some extent even like high sci-fi, I've never been a fan of. Primarily because what kind of bugs me, particularly, and this is maybe just like a personal preference, what kind of bugs me, something that I see in either like sci-fi or sci-fi fantasy or fantasy, is that so like you have the opening and it sets the ground rules and it builds the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the issue that I usually find, or one of my biggest frustrations in uh, sagas like this, is that they'll, as you go on, they'll just introduce like other shit and other elements that kind of like not like it's not like a get out of jail free card, but kind of like muddy the like it's like okay, well I thought these were the stakes, and now the stakes are changed, and it kind of like for me like a perfect example is, and this is going to be relevant because we're going to be talking about that plot point in Lord of the Rings. Someone asked me about resurrection in Game of Thrones. I really, really do not like that. I think for a series that is like really about like, it's meant to be more of like a grounded like, hey, if you're dead, it's like it's over and it's like done and it's good. The fact that like later in the narrative they introduce the concept of resurrection, it's now in some cases they do it well. So for example, with spoilers for the Game of Thrones books, for example, Lady Stoneheart with Catelyn Stark, they introduce, oh, but she resurrects, but it's she's like a zombie basically. Like she's like a shell of her former self.
There's a deep cost to resurrection. It's not just
Yes.
like you're back to normal. It's like you're a shell of your former self.
Yes. But now I'm curious whenever Winds of Winter comes out because it's very likely that Jon Snow is going to be
Yeah.
resurrected. It's the president is in the show, and it just he's fine. It's
Yeah.
there's no he's exactly the same, and it's like okay, so now that we've established this is a thing,
Yeah.
why don't we teach this to everybody?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's that's the sort of issue that I have with it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So just to lay the groundwork, I have never been a fan of high fantasy or anything like that, high
Yeah.
sci-fi. Yeah. Um, and so I watched me and my girlfriend watched Fellowship, and I really enjoyed it. I think Fellowship is the strongest. Maybe I don't know if I say by far, but I think Fellowship is really the strongest,
I
and
think
that's
I'd
not
agree with
even.
that.
I think even like a lot of fans even agree on that from
Yeah,
what I've seen.
I think that is the consensus. I think Fellowship is ranked the highest of the three.
Yep, I think it's perfect. It's great setup, um, great building of stakes, really good action scenes. Even some of the action scenes in that one, especially, I think even hold up today. It was like really well done. Um, and then there was Gandalf's death towards the end of the film. Awesome, like perfect like dramatic beat of like Frodo, like oh the shit is on now. It's good. Boromir's death was very moving. I enjoyed it. So yeah, so even though like the setting really wasn't my cup of tea, I think Fellowship was very strong and I enjoyed it. Two Towers, I just at some point during it, I just completely checked out, and I don't really know why exactly. I understand from a structure perspective that at the end of the first film they all kind of go off on their separate paths, but even so, it felt like the pacing just kind of full disclaimer, I watched the theatrical cuts. I did not watch the extended. The pacing I thought was just terrible. Particularly or not or maybe I shouldn't say there are some issues I have with pacing, particularly the fact that like it seemed like in certain storylines, nothing kind of like they would have scenes, but nothing would move forward. Particularly for the Two Towers, where the Sam, Frodo, and Gollum scenes. I think like the opening scenes were great, like when we first meet him and like the dynamic, that's awesome. But then as the rest of the film went on, particularly as the other plot is setting up the Helm's Deep battle, um, they would cut back to Sam and Frodo, and obviously like because like oh hey you want to like remind the guys that they're still here, and I felt like nothing was kind of moving forward. It just kind of felt like they were like all of those scenes kind of felt the same to me. I will say in Return of the King, that was not an issue. I think the Frodo Sam Gollum scenes were a lot more okay. Now like things are actually moving. It's very, but for it felt like in the Twin Towers, those scenes in particular, and I was really looking forward to them because I was really looking forward to finally see Gollum. Um, it felt like all those scenes were just treading water. Yeah.
So that's interesting. And I can see your point on some of these. And I want to preface this by saying my own defense of I'm not the biggest Lord of the Rings fan in terms of like I'm not a super nerd about the books. Like I'm not. I do really like the film trilogy, And I like the books to an extent, but I'm not the biggest Tolkien. Like, you will meet hardcore Tolkien nerds out there.
Oh
So
my god, I
yeah,
have. I
yeah,
have. Oh my god.
yeah. And I'm not offended by any interpretation. Like that's like, I think it's a completely valid interpretation. I think you're gonna feel the same way when I start laying into Dune a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I will offer some defense of some of these things. So I for the Gollum scenes in part two, in two towers. I think the point of that whole arc in that story was the kind of tragedy of Gollum. We're introduced. We don't see him in part. I mean, we see him very briefly in the first one, and he's a very monstrous figure. And then we meet him in part two, and we learned that he's a very, like, a tragic figure in a way. He's
Mhm.
very, like, he's like a drug addict, basically. That's what he is. Like, he's consumed by the ring, and he even though he's monstrous at times, he starts to form a bond with Frodo and even Sam to an extent, even though he and Sam have a much more antagonistic relationship. Um, and it's seeming like he might be able to overcome this dark part of himself. But then there's this kind of tragedy with what happens. There's a misunderstanding between the two. I think the misunderstanding is a little weak. Like, I think that plot point is a little weak, honestly. But I think the whole point of Frodo, of the Gollum storyline in part two, is this kind of tragedy that's setting up the conflict that's going to be in the third movie.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's like I understood the concept of it, and I understood that, like, oh, come Return of the King, this is where we're going to see that play out. But it felt like throughout the second film, that plotline in particular, again, while Helm's Deep, that plotline had a lot of shit going on with Theoden and everything, and the setup and the battle. And I was like, although, um, quick segue, why did they bait Aragorn's death later in the movie? I thought that was, I was like, what are we doing?
I could see that. That's something I hadn't really thought of before, just because it just kind of folds into the action of the film. It's like, oh, we had the battle with the wargs, the wolf creatures. Aragorn almost dies. It's dramatic and stuff like that. I think it's also setting up he has that kind of vision about the elf girl, his love interest.
Hmm.
And it's a lot of the movie is about, a lot of Aragorn's story throughout the whole thing is him taking steps to accept his role as
As
the
the
King of
king.
Gondor.
Yeah.
And he's very much in ranger mode in one, and also in two towers. Like, he's him going to the defense of Helm's Deep, and he has that great scene. I love it with Legolas, when Legolas, like, they're all gonna die, and he's like, then I'll die with them. It's like it's very heroic, but it's also he's much more embraced to the role of, like, the soldier and a man of the army than he is of, like, the king yet.
Mm.
And I think maybe they were trying to set up that with that scene of him and the elf girl, of like, there's more to you than this, like, right, there's like you're going to eventually accept your destiny as, like, the king. I agree with you, though. It is they just kind of resolve it. He just kind of comes back, and it's ultimately not that you could have cut that little sequence, and it wouldn't have taken a lot out of the film.
Especially in like a 3 hour movie. I'm like,
Yeah,
especially, like, it's, for me, Two Towers was like, Fellowship. I didn't actually, patience wise, I was fine. It
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
feel like paced very well. Two Towers, whereas, and in its defense, one of the issue with that is because they had a lot of different plot lines.
Hmm.
It felt very much like this would be suited better for, like, maybe like a television series,
Yeah, yeah.
because you had all these plot lines and they kind of were like very disparate. They rarely weren't like connected. I mean, they were all connected to the world, but like, probably my one of my biggest critiques of it, because I think the Battle of Helm's Deep, that whole sequence is excellent. There are a couple of smaller things, like I felt like they made like a big deal of the, was it the elf leader when he dies?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's like sometimes they're like, it was like a big moment for, like, Aragorn, and he's
Yeah.
like, oh, he's dead. But I feel like it was kind of like we hardly knew this guy. I think we only saw him like in two scenes.
Yeah.
Um, and it kind of felt like the music and, was doing a lot of heavy lifting
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
like, and that is a circumstance where when I was watching it, I'm like, oh, I wonder if he had more of a role in the movies, or maybe even the extended cut. I don't.
I
Yeah.
don't think so. I think it's more
No.
so just like um he's he's an elf, and it's like we're losing the magic of this world. Like that's a big theme of the books. It's like the magic is slowly leaving the world. The elves are leaving. They're going to the afterlife basically. And this guy, I mean, he was introduced previously. I think he was one of the groups that like ambushes them when they're in the forest in the first one, and takes them to the Elf Queen, Gladriel.
Mhm.
I think he's part of that group. I'm not 100% sure, but it was kind of, and it's also kind of like he had there was a little bit of prejudice there beginning. Like again, the races of elves and dwarves and humans had been very separate for a long time, but him showing up with the elves was like, hey, the elves and the humans are going to work together again for the first time since defeating Sauron. So I think that's what it was about. But I agree, he wasn't the most. I mean, most of the characters honestly are not the most developed characters overall.
So funny enough, so here I'll say this and then I'll go on to that. Because I think I got into like sort of a scuffle on Twitter about it, where I think the Helm's Deep sequence in and of itself is excellent. I really like it. The issue I had, and the reason that kind of like it didn't kind of like in terms of pacing, was the fact that they kept cutting back to the end storyline
Mhm.
with Merry and Pippin, and it was like, so the argument would be, I a a a comparison I would use is like, imagine you're watching like a car chase,
Mhm.
and then like intermittently throughout the car chase, it'll cut away to a different scene where there's two other characters doing stuff that isn't related, or what's the word I'm looking for, consequential to the car chase. I'd be like, well, that's kind of weird. Like, you probably just want to show the car chase to sequence in and of itself completely. For me, the Battle of Helm's Deep, it was weird because they kept cutting back to the end storyline, and while I like that storyline in the sense that, like, it, marrying Pippin, and they're rousing the Ents to take on
Yeah.
Saruman. It did, because it wasn't consequential to the outcome of the Battle of Helm's Deep. It seemed kind of like jarring. Like,
Yeah.
so a comparison as to where this works very well in Return of the King is obviously the final battle where they're, fighting at the Black Gate, trying to give Sam and Frodo time.
Yeah.
The reason that the cutting back and forth works is because the tension is,
Yeah.
where it's what Sam and Frodo are doing is consequential to what's going to
Yeah.
happen there. We want to they have to do that before it's our Aragorn and the other killed. Whereas for the Helm's Deep, it kept cutting back to like, and like, not to like, again, I the end storyline in and itself was fine, but it's like,
Yeah.
it goes from like this like really hardcore like gripping action to like them
Yeah.
just kind of like trotting through the forest, and I'm kind of like,
Yeah.
fuck, like, damn. But
Yeah.
again, in its defense, I understand that, like, I can only imagine when like Peter Jackson, and this isn't like to say this isn't like a book defense, but it's like, I can only imagine when they looked at the book and was like, you have all these plot lines. You like, would ideally, would it be awesome to have the Battle of Helm's Deep just be like one interrupted sequence? I think so. But I understand that, like, you have all these plot lines going on, these different characters, so you kind of have to juggle, you kind of have to cut where you
Yeah.
can. So yeah, that is, I understand that, but it
Yeah.
seemed,
I don't necessarily know if it would work better as one sequence, because I think that like it might get old after a while to just see them constantly like killing orcs left and right. And again, like the orcs, they suffer from this problem of all like big army battles, which is that we don't know any of the orcs, so there's no like character conflict between them. And so I think just like again, like 30 or 40 minutes of them just killing orcs would get old after a while. So I think cutting actually helps kind of like break up the pacing a little bit and make it also it feels a little bit more believable that they lasted all night, because that's the purpose of the battle. Gandalf tells them like, you're not going to win, just last until the first light of the third day,
mhm.
and then I'm going to come in and save the day. And they do that. I will agree with you that, and you didn't bring this up right now, but I saw it on Twitter. You talked about Saruman and his very, very
Okay,
like
yeah.
anticlimactic disappearance from the series. And I
Yeah.
don't know if you
Now,
watched the extended edition or not.
I have heard that it is in the extended cut, yes.
But even in the extended cut, it's not really like he just dies in a scene. It's not really impactful. And it's part of this is the book. Again, it's the book defense. Is like he after they defeat Sauron at the very end, Saruman's still around and he's kind of taken over the Shire. And there's this like sequence where they have to go defeat him, and it's a lot of people, even fans of the book, didn't like
Oh,
that.
really? That
Yeah,
sounds
did it?
nuts.
Well, the whole book discussion would have to be a different time. The Scouring of the Shire is a very controversial ending to the thing.
Mhm.
Um, but I think Peter Jackson was kind of trapped into that, where it's like he can't give like it would naturally, like you would think that like Saruman would be the bad guy of the second film, right? Because he's the secondary antagonist. His defeat would be a big climax, and then we'll go defeat Sauron in the third. But
Mhm.
because of the structure of the book, I think he couldn't really do that. But I agree with you 100% that like if you're just a casual watcher of the film, like you're just like, what the fuck happened with Saruman? He's just like gone.
Well, it's weird because, like, there's the scene where they arrive there and the Ent leader is there and he's like, "Yeah, he's up in the tower."
Yeah,
It's like, "Okay, well,
you're just gonna
can we,
watch him.
like" yeah, can we, like, go up and, like, just kind of, like, have, like, Gandalf be like, "Sup, bitch?" Like,
Yeah,
not anything, we're not even gonna see it. And the issue with that in particular, it's not so much like, well, if he was just, like, he's not Sauron, he's not, like, the main bad guy, but he kind of was in the first 2 movies where I mean, at
yeah,
least he was, like, the stand-in
yeah,
for
exactly.
Sauron, yeah.
Yeah,
And so that was a letdown, and then come the 3rd movie, and this is a scene that I had seen, I had heard about and seen like hundreds of times. Was forgive me, who is the leader of the um Dementor looking motherfuckers?
oh, the Witch King of
Yes.
Angor or whatever. Yeah,
So there was a scene where Gandalf tells, I think, Mary, it's like, oh yeah, well now this guy's coming, like he's the big guy, and he's
yeah,
like, he looks really cool.
yeah,
His
yeah,
like mask is cool, like his the birdie, the creature he flies on. I'm like, oh man, this guy's badass.
yeah,
And then the only time we see him, like, really, is when he kills Theoden, and
yeah.
then immediately after, no man can kill me, and then it's like Pippin
I
stabs
am no
him,
man.
and then I am.
Yeah,
Well, it's funny because I felt even worse because I had heard of that scene, but it's like I actually did not like Ewan as a character. I don't know what even her
she's
purpose
very
was.
flat. She's very flat.
Yeah, I'm not like why, like, I at first, like, when she shows up in Two Towers, I thought that, and maybe I am mistaken. Did her and Aragon have any history before that?
No, I mean she likes him, like because I
Okay,
mean he's sexy as hell, but
yeah, it's just,
he's like I can't be with you because my heart is pledged to the elf girl.
and like, I think that would be like, and I feel bad to like say like she's kind of a device, but like I think that would have been fine of like, oh, she had a crush on you, but like you prove yourself. But then like in the third movie, now she has this whole other arc, and I'm like, mm, it's like, okay, and then
Yeah,
it's, yeah,
yeah, she's not. Her role is like she's kind of like this feminist type character, but they honestly don't do enough with her to really justify that. I will say they do tell you that the Witch King was the one who stabbed Frodo on
they do, yeah,
Weathertop. I wish they would have made him a little bit more distinctive in the first one because
yes.
you don't even realize it. Like, I mean, yes, you see him in that when he puts on the ring, you see he's got like the crown and stuff, but
I
he
almost
he
thought it
honestly
was like,
probably should have had that mask from the beginning.
yeah, I almost thought it was like a retcon at some point. I was like, is
Yeah,
that
it,
just
it
like,
feels like one.
yeah, I was like, yeah, because I was like, oh, that's a really cool, because it kind of like reminded me of, like, again, to kind of compare it to Game of Thrones, you had uh Joffrey, and then who's kind of like, I think I made a joke in one of my videos of like he's like Squirtle, and then you have Ramsay
Yeah.
who's like War Turtle, and then you
Yeah,
have Euron,
yeah.
at
It's
least
the
in the books,
final
not,
evolution. Yeah,
yeah, not in the, he's not very good in the
not the
show.
not the finger up the bum guy.
Yeah, so it seemed like it's like, okay, so you have Sauron. It's like, okay, and then he's kind of like the tier 1 villain, and then
Yeah,
he kind of goes to the second one, and then okay, he's done, and then okay,
yeah,
now this is the real bad guy. I'm like, okay,
yeah.
cool, but I felt like his whole, the which, and again, it's hard because it's I mean, depending on like the extended versions, but still, like even that, it's like I feel like you're cramming so much into
Yeah.
these movies, even if they are longer. You're
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
cram so much and do so much.
Yeah.
Sometimes it almost felt like certain characters only kind of got like one big beat, and like that
Yeah.
was it. Yeah.
I felt the same way about the son from Rohan, the cuz like the king has it's like a niece and a nephew,
Yes.
the brother and sister. Like the brother just disappears from the after the second film. I mean, he comes back at the end of the second film with Gandalf. He wins the battle and he's just kind of not he doesn't really do anything in the third one. I mean,
Was it
he's there.
Faramir?
No, no, no. Not him. He actually has a good
He is
character
a
arc.
good.
Boromir's brother. I'm talking about the brother of the sister of the king of Rohan, who was
Oh, the leader of the
the leader.
riders.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
my apologies. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
sorry.
No, no, no.
Carl
Again,
Urban.
Carl Urban,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
It's totally normal for you not to remember him because he kind of doesn't really do anything after. Like again, he's got
Yeah.
a critical role in the ending of the Battle of Helm's Deep, but besides that, like he doesn't do anything. And I was like, we could have developed this character out more.
Yeah.
Especially since
Um,
Rohan was such like a very interesting place with like I like Theoden's interesting. Eowyn is kind of okay. I would have liked to see more of him.
yeah, and it's strange because, and I'm sure, like, I wonder if you're going to bring this up during the Dune talk. One thing that I like about Dune, or one reason that I sort of like give it a pass on certain things, is because Dune is above all more of a sort of like a very streamlined one. It's really about Paul's journey. Funny enough, Denis Villeneuve actually compared him to Michael Corleone in The Godfather. I saw it on Twitter and it's like, oh, that actually works very well. Um, and so it is a very like it is like there's a lot of characters, they have their own motivations, but it is primarily about um, uh, Paul. So that means so for me when like people say, "Oh, these other characters aren't like super fleshed out," it's like, well, that's kind of because it's really Paul's story. Whereas with Lord of the Rings, when I'm watching it, it feels very much like an ensemble. They're kind of like doing it, and so it kind of like gave me those expectations, very similar to like Game of Thrones, where it's like there really is no main. There are more prominent characters, but there's no real main character, and yet it felt like in the Lord of the Rings films, it kept sort of like it almost was like I'm trying to think of the right term. Everyone was almost stretched too thin, at least for me, or at least like outside of like Aragorn and Frodo and Sam, of course. The two big uh, disappointments for me, and this is completely based off of like because I knew of them um, from like just knowing because they're iconic characters. Um, I was really surprised that Gimli and Legolas really did not have as much characterization. I was really surprised by that. I was especially, I one thing I have heard from book fans is that Gimli gets the short end of the stick. Apparently, he's a lot different in the books,
Yeah,
and kind of in
he's
the
used
movies.
mostly for comic relief in the
Yeah,
Lord of the Rings movies. The only real development they have is that Gimli learns to stop being a racist, basically.
and then that's another thing is like that line at the end. I had seen that everywhere. The how about if I have a friend, and I was like, oh, that's a really cool beat. But then when I'm watching the the movie, I'm like, I don't like. I guess you could say it's like, well, they work together the whole time, and they kind of go. I'm like, but I didn't. Did they even really have any like sort of like one-on-one scenes where they kind of hashed it out?
Not really.
Yeah,
It's more so just again. There's no real time for that, so
I know. And
their
again,
their
I'm
their respect is just through the action of the film, and
yeah.
there are a few moments. I mean, there's something like when the riders surround them in Rohan. The son is like, I would cut your head off, dwarf. If it was a little higher from the ground, and Legolas immediately is like, I'll fucking kill you if you touch him, and it's a
Well,
nice moment. It's like they're like we see a bond growing between the two of them, but Legolas, especially, he's like a cool character, but he really doesn't go anywhere in the film. Like he's not even racist, like against dwarves. Like in the way that Gimli at least overcomes his discrimination against dwarves.
so yeah, there was that. And again, I completely understand that part of this is probably the fact that like, and I don't mean to like put this on fans of the movies, I understand that like a good part of this, Lord of the Rings for many people was like, because I got the same reaction with Avatar, where of all Breaking Bad, Sopranos, of all the shows I've talked about, Avatar was like the one series where it's like they were like the fans were like fuck you, and I understand because like if you grew up with it, if this was like a very fundamental piece of media for your childhood, it's like it, it's very instilled.
Which is weird though,
um
because like the Lord of the Rings movies are not without controversy. Like there are book fundamentalists who hate them. Like
I read up a lot on that. Yeah, they were like really do not like them.
Tolkien's son hates the films, like he despises them.
Really?
Um his son, so I can't remember the names of all of it, but Tolkien's son was the inheritor of the estate, and he like kind of guarded all the properties. And he was like he had already they had already signed a deal for the movies like years before this, so he couldn't do anything about them. But he's like no more of this shit, like we're keeping it very book oriented from now on. His son, so the son of the son, I think his name's Simon Tolkien. He is like, do whatever the fuck you want as long as you pay me, which is how we got the Amazon Rings of Power series. He's like, I don't
Ah,
give a shit what you do with it as long as I get a
I
paycheck.
heard that was ass, bro.
Yeah, like that again. The book purists hate this, but anyway, my point was that like it's the series is not like this, like Avatar. The fan base is all united around the original series because there's nothing
Mhm.
else, right? But the Lord
Because
the Tolkien community is divided because there's people who are like fucking surfboarding on a shield on the Battle of Helm's Deep. That's fucking stupid, right? Like all this other stuff is stupid action bullshit,
oh,
and there's controversy within the community.
that was another thing that kind of upset me was the fact that like when I compare the Battle of Helm's Deep, while it was really good, I didn't like the cutting, but the battle itself was I thought it was fantastic, the way it was structured, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
So, and again, like when we're talking about like raising stakes, like I use the example of like Sauron to the Witch King, and it
yeah,
was kind of like a step down.
yeah.
The Battle of Minas Tirith, I thought was like a huge step down from the Battle
Oh
of
yeah,
Helm's
no, no.
Deep.
Everyone feels that way.
I was like watching it, I'm like, what the fuck? And it's like because you set the bar, like the Battle of Helm's
Yeah,
Deep was fucking based. It
yeah,
was
yeah,
awesome.
yeah, yeah,
Just the way it was like the tactics they were using, it was so
yeah.
cool. Um, even surpassing like even like looking back to like Game of Thrones, like Battle of the Bastards,
Yeah. No, everyone feels
Blackwater.
that way. The Battle of Minas Tirith is not as interesting as the Battle of Helm's Deep.
Are-
Even though there are cool stuff in there, like it feels like it doesn't feel as earned. Like the Ghost Army is a powerful moment for Aragorn because he's accepting his destiny as the king of Gondor. He's finally they reforged the sword, like put the ranger aside, become the man you were always meant to be. It's a good character moment, but in terms of like battle aesthetic, having just a ghost army overrun the other army is just like, what are we doing here? Like this isn't that
yeah.
interesting.
Well, it was more for me. It was more the fact that like they bring in the elephants, and I'm like, oh shit, these guys are gonna fuck shit up. And then like Legolas takes down one
Yeah,
by
it's
himself, and then Eowyn takes one down by just like slicing their. I'm like, okay, well, I thought
yeah,
they were gonna be
it's
more threatening.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's again the action style. That's what the some of the book purists don't like is the kind of heavy-handed action we get during some of these moments. There's
yeah,
great character stuff too, but a lot of the action can kind of be a little bit cheesy at times, which a lot of people don't like.
yeah. And then there's the so that is probably one of and in um everyone's defense, I know even people who are like staunch book defenders or sorry staunch movie defenders agree that the Army of the Dead is kind of a cop out. But that was an example of when like they get to Minas Tirith and they're like ready for the battle. It's like, what are we gonna do? It's like, well, there's this like cave with dead people. It's like, wait a minute, hang on. Where it kind of feels like you're kind of tossing that into. And again, I did like that was like, as you point out, that was the moment where Aragorn was kind of went from ranger mode. It's like, okay, now I need to step into the role of the king in order to sway them. But I just kind of felt like it. And on one hand, I'm like, I do sort of appreciate that they're kind of like they're putting the character moment first, which I really appreciate. But it was like you couldn't find another Like, or even like, even if it was like the Ghost Army, you couldn't have made it like, I don't know, it couldn't have been like more like decisive, like kind of close. But it's just like, no, they like whoop, and it's like,
Well,
oh,
it's
okay,
also the problem is that the Battle of Minas Tirith is not the climactic battle of the series. Like, yes, they
yeah,
win, but then they have to go to the Black Gates and fight. And now, I mean, obviously, they don't. The strategic victory is not important there. It's about buying time for Frodo, but it does suffer from this thing of like, we're not even done yet. We got to go do another thing
I was
after this.
for me, I was almost confused because like with Minas Tirith, I thought that was almost going to be the climax, and then it cuts to Frodo when he gets stung by Shelob, and I'm kind of like looking at my watch. I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
You know what's
Yeah,
interesting about that too. I'm sure some book fans are gonna get mad at me if I get this wrong, but I think that in the books, that happens like at the end of book 2. So I think you're like you
the
go into
Shelob.
book 3 thinking that he's like dead, which is it's more of like a shock
Oh,
than in the movie. I think in the movie the timing doesn't work out as well because you're like it's not left at this cliffhanger that he's gone as
gotcha.
much. But I mean, don't get me wrong. The Battle of the Black Gate, I think, is cool, and I really like
Yes.
Aragorn's speech. It's a great speech, and it's again, it's about this theme of like it doesn't matter what happens to us here. Our fate's in Frodo's hands, and we're gonna do whatever it takes to support him. And that's a great thing about the film of the trilogy is like how much it empowers these very small, weak people who it's like these are the ultimate heroes of the story. Yes, Aragorn's a hero, but he's not the hero. It's
Hmm.
Frodo, it's Sam, it's Merry, it's Pippin. And that's what a lot of people really like. And especially that final moment with Sam and Frodo being like, Sam's like, I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. And his strength to be more than like the kind of cowardly supportive figure he was throughout the film, he rises. And that's ultimately what I think people really love about the films, is this very hopeful, very optimistic message of we can all find inner strength and good's going to triumph over evil. And I know you talked about it on Twitter. That's not your favorite
No.
theme for a book or whatever, but
And that's the thing. I completely agree that this is like a lot of my contention with it is more of like completely. That's one of the ones where I'm like, I do have like my own particular issues, but that is something where I'm like, I think that is completely like it's just not the story for me. I'm more of like a postmodern cuck, Yeah.
I mean,
Um.
to be fair though, this story was meant to serve as like an origin story for England. Like it was like Tolkien's
Yeah.
like making a mythology for England, and it's meant to have that happy note. In fact, he was actually working on some other books that would take place afterwards that were more darker and more like
Ooh.
more emotionally complicated. But again, we don't have time for a book discussion or
Yeah.
anything like that. But
Um.
it is it's we can't get away from Tolkien's like spirituality and his like his optimism and his belief in this kind of stuff. It's like it's just ingrained in the world, and if you love those themes, you're gonna like this one.
So now it's time. I think so. Yeah. So I do have my issues with like how Battle of Helm's Deep was cut. I have my issues with Minas Tirith. But that whole sequence, even like the endings were like it has like 8 endings. I didn't really think it was nearly as bad as people hyped it up to be. I did think Bilbo coming back at the very end. I understand thematically, but I almost was like, oh yeah, shit,
Yeah, it's
Bilbo.
like again, you have to understand that like Hobbit was the first book that was written,
Yeah,
and
that's true.
so it's in the books. It's like again, it's connecting this character. But yeah, I agree with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, so it wasn't nearly as bad as I, expected it. People like maybe it's worse than the extended, but yeah, people hyped it up of like there's like 8 endings. It's like it wasn't that bad.
No, and I think they're all very thematic. Like I think it's
Yeah.
there's a sadness going into it. It's like Magic's leaving, Frodo's leaving. It's like we won, but there was a cost to it all.
Yeah, I
And
did like that. I agree. I almost like that beat of like after I think funny enough I watched Clerks too. And there's a whole scene where they like where Randall, one of the characters, shits on Lord of the Rings, and
yeah.
he said that like it should have just ended when they were jumping on the bed, and Sam gives him that gay ass look. That's what he says. But I'm like, no, I actually kind of like the thematic of like they return, they're kind of somber, and
Yeah.
yeah, actually, I like that. Um, so that's good. I'm trying to think of anything else that I might take issue with. Um, the whole eagle thing. Funny enough, that was a plot point that everyone was like, why aren't they flying there? But they actually do explain that.
Even if
It's
they
like,
don't, who gives a shit? Like,
well,
that's
that's the
such a
thing. It's like
pedantic argument.
it's pedantic, but it's like I'm also like, well, they established that Sauron has like this big eye, and the fact that like I like the theme of like, oh, he's like this big eye, but he doesn't see the two little, or he doesn't really think
Yeah,
of,
yeah. It's again,
yeah,
it's their smallness and the fact that you'd overlook them is what lets them succeed.
yeah. So I thought that was kind of a weird one. However, because we got 5 minutes, so we got to switch, but um, I still don't understand Gandalf's whole deal. I
I
know,
mean, we were
I know, I know. Well, it's funny because we talked about it. I think on
Tolkien's
the
a
last,
Christian.
yeah. Well, but so here's the thing though, is like, so I'm like, I asked him like, okay, so I thought it kind of sucked that like that's a huge moment in the first movie, and then he just kind of comes back. And what's interesting is I was on Twitter and I've been arguing with people like the last couple of days. It's I've gotten like 8 different answers. Like one person says, yeah, he did resurrect, and then I had another person tell me it's like, well, no, he didn't even die. And I'm like, well, I think he did.
I don't I
I
don't
don't know.
honestly know. Like I told you before, again, and book arguments are not valid for this, but like Gandalf, this isn't really conveyed in the movie, really, but Gandalf is an angel. Like he's a god, in the same way Galadriel and Saruman are. Like they're not mortal beings. Like they're part of the godhood in the same way that Sauron is, but they're at a lower level.
Hmm.
So that's not really conveyed, and it doesn't really matter. It's like ultimately who gives a shit about some of this lore stuff. I think you just ultimately have to accept that it's a Christ thing,
I know.
that it's a
Yeah.
spirit. There's a spirituality to this thing that like you're just not gonna like. And you're not the only one, by the way. George R. R. Martin, who I love his work more than anything else in all of fantasy. He doesn't like that Gandalf came back. He would have kept him dead.
Well,
So
well,
can't
that's
argue
what's so
with George.
well, that's what's so funny because I was arguing with a couple people, and one of the people said, "Oh, so you don't like that? Well, what do you feel? So you're cool with like Jon Snow coming back?" And I'm like, "No, I think that's dumb." Actually, like
Unless there's
again,
a cost, unless there's a personal cost to it, but there
yeah,
is no cost to. In fact, Gandalf levels up.
that's the thing. It's like he levels. If you know what would have been cool, at least someone mentioned to me. It's like, what if he kind of like, I think what would have been interesting, like what if he was resurrected, but all of like his past memories of his friends were gone, and like that would have been like, so like now these people are like Gandalf, and they're like, that would have been like, imagine like that like really sad moment at the end when Gandalf comes in to greet Frodo, and he's not there really. um
But then you kind of be saying that like Jesus Christ wasn't more powerful when he came back from the dead, and that's just not. Again, Tolkien,
yeah, I know.
Tolkien is steeped in this world of Christianity,
you
and it's
know
like
you
it's
just
important to
know
him.
you just know when JC rolled out of that cave, he was just like,
He's better
bitches.
than ever. He's stronger than fucking ever.
And he sees the Roman soldiers. He's like, "What's
Yeah,
up, brother?"
he's gonna light him up with his magic. So,
I had
uh,
I had an idea for a comedy skit, where it's like a, a talk show with Jesus Christ, and like one of the guests, like he'll have like Judas on. It's like, "Hey bro, what's up?" He'd have who would he have on? Darwin. Charles Darwin. It's like, "Hey bro, so like all that shit you've been talking."
yeah,
And
you
then
think
like,
we came from monkeys, you dumb
"Oh yeah,
bitch.
wow, that's really." And then of course they'll have the two Roman soldiers. It's like, bet you feel like stupid now. But yeah, so I know we have to wrap up this section, but like, yeah, they're not. Again, I understand that like I do have my smaller issues, um, but yeah, it just didn't hit for me, and I don't know why. Maybe
I think that's totally a valid interpretation. Like, I think that like not everything is gonna hit with everyone, and I think like you also weren't like shitting on it where you're like this is awful. Like anyone who likes this has terrible taste. It's like
yeah, I
you
would
see
joke
that.
and say it's like
Yeah,
mid, and I'm
you're
like, well, no,
joking.
yeah,
Like you see the validity in it even if you don't personally enjoy it. And
of course,
I think transitioning into our Dune talk here, that is my thoughts going into this too. I see the validity of this. I can see
okay,
why people like it. But for me it did not hit. And I think there's three. there's three things, general topics. We'll dive into each one of them. So,
All right.
um, I watched Dune Part One when it came out. Like, was it 1 year or 2 years ago?
Oh my god, maybe
I think,
3.
was it 3 years ago?
I
Really?
think because it was during COVID.
Oh, you're
Me and my
right. You're
girlfriend
right. Yeah,
watched
yeah.
it here at home.
So it was a
Um,
long time.
yeah.
So I watched it then. Didn't think too much of it. I didn't hate it, but I was just like, it's just there's some stuff that happened. I didn't really jive with it too much. Then part two came out, and I do have to acknowledge that I think I am someone who, if I hear nothing but praise for something, I will kind of go into it being like, oh really?
You're a little skeptical. Yeah, that's
This is
fair.
the best thing ever, really.
That's
And
fair.
I think that if I had not known anything about this one, I might have appreciated it more. But the over amount of hype that I heard for it made me just when the movie ended, I was like, "That's it." Like, did I watch a different movie?
Well, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, okay. There's the three topics. We'll dive into each of them. Was one, I felt like the characters were flat. A lot of them. They didn't really have driving motivations that made me really interested in them.
Hmm.
Two, I thought it was very anticlimactic for like essentially having two movies worth of buildup to just the ending just kind of like happens and it doesn't really feel that earned. And then three, I don't know. I just kind of felt a little boring to me. Like I didn't know what was this all building towards. I do understand like there's going to be a jihad and billions are going to die or whatever, but we don't actually see that. And I was like, well, then what was the point of what we went through for all this? And maybe it'll happen in Dune Messiah, but
Oh, it will. But it's really funny you say that. So here's sort of like the history of for those who don't know, here's sort of like the history because I think it is to your point about I think it is important. I mean, like you can still critique a film, but I think it is important to sort of like take into account a author or creative's worldview when you're viewing that film. And so, to your extent, I think that like I don't think that like with the whole Gandalf thing, I don't think like you or anyone else is saying like you should just hand wave it, but I'm saying it's like, okay, but give it context, understand his worldview. Um, Herbert was not. I think people said that like I forget if it was the other way around. I think it was Tolkien who said like he either read Dune and he fucking hated it, or he was like he like knew of it and was like, I'm not even reading that shit. That sounds awful.
I really think he hated Dune, and I think he didn't like it at all.
Okay, so maybe he read. Yeah, it's like, yeah, he fucking hated it because, ironically, what's so funny about us talking about these two movies is that their worldviews are diametrically opposed. They are like Lord of the Rings is very optimistic, very like good versus evil. Dune is just. Oh, and what's so funny about that is that Dune itself is almost structured as a sort of like I don't want to say like meta ironic, but it's very like it plays into almost up until like the third act of part two. It plays into the idea of this like very generic. He is the son of the duke, and his family is betrayed, and he bonds with the people, and they're going to return and take over the planet and rule. And like so, like okay, like I can see how that would be a perfect like, yay, we're gonna win, yeah, but then throughout it, there's all this like weird, like, I don't know, like, really? And then we get to the end of part two, and like, admittedly, um, that one scene where, when like Paul comes in and he's rousing the troops in a regular like chosen one narrative, this would be like a very like triumphant scene, but it's paired with like, I think people have noted it's almost shot like a horror movie. It's like, oh wait, hang on, what's going on, like why are like isn't this supposed to be like the moment of victory, but like it's kind of uncomfortable and scary and disturbing.
It's very much I totally get the theme of it's like it's challenging this notion of the chosen one and if it's a good thing or not. I mean, in the movie and the books, I assume I actually read part of Dune. I have it right here. I never
Nice.
finished it. But so I'm sort of familiar with the book.
Hmm.
And I totally get the themes of it, and I'm totally fine exploring that. Like I think Game of Thrones to an extent has a little bit of a foot in both camps. Like it's got a little bit
Yes.
of the chosen one, and it's got a little bit of the critique of the chosen one.
Yes. Although the
Um,
show kind of, I
leans
think
more
that's an
towards the
issue.
chosen one.
It
Yeah,
towards the end, it kind of goes, or like
yeah,
if Game of Thrones is here between like Dune and Lord of the Rings, like up until like the middle, you're like, okay, this is a good mix,
yeah.
and then at the end, it's kind of
Way
like,
too Lord of the Rings.
yes, yep.
But here's my critique of that theme of the movie, which is I totally get it, like intellectually, but I question, like, in terms of like impact on the story,
Hmm.
what so the movie presents this idea that Paul being the chosen one, or Paul assuming the role of the Messiah, is a bad thing because it's going to lead to this jihad. It's going to kill billions of people, and it's going to create this, totalitarian state or whatever. But how is that worse than what we have right now? Which is,
Hmm.
I felt like the villains of the series, the Harkonnens and the Emperor, for as much shit as people give Lord of the Rings for being like, oh, it's good versus evil, very simplistic, the bad guy has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. The Harkonnens are the exact same way.
They're
There's
like
nothing redeeming about
unbelievable.
them.
Yes, they're like
Like,
the worst.
there's nothing, and I'm like, I understand intellectually I'm supposed to like feel horrified when Paul does this, but it's like, what was the alternative? Letting the Harkonnens win? At least Paul has this core of decency that I felt kind of undermined the horror that it was going for when he uh becomes the Messiah figure. It's like it's more intellectual than direct impact on the story for me, because we
Yes.
don't have that kind of character relevance.
So it's so funny you bring that up because you're completely correct. And this is ironic. This is like, again, to go back to kind of like the history of Dune. When Dune originally came out, and we can talk about a couple of the changes, particularly with Zendaya's character Chani.
Mhm.
When
I got
Dune
thoughts on
came
her.
out, Brian Herbert was I'm sorry, Frank Herbert. My apologies. Brian is his son.
The Sun,
Who
yeah, I know him,
very
yeah.
that's a whole, and like the Dune fans do not. Some are like very respectful of Brian. Others want to fucking kill that guy.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is very funny. Um, so when Dune came out, Frank Herbert was very upset because there were a lot of people who read the book and were like, kind of to your point, they were like, "Fuck yeah, Paul, he did it." And Frank was like, "Wait, no, that's not what I was. It
Yeah,
was not supposed to be a victorious ending. It was
yeah.
supposed to be a very like cold, calculated. He's not a hero. They're all just pawns in a pointless game."
Yeah,
Um, and so the legend goes is that is in part why he wrote. I don't know if he originally intended to write Dune Messiah, which is
mhm.
going to be the third movie in the trilogy, I guess,
Yeah,
but it's the second book that concludes Paul's
yeah,
story. In fact, a lot of Dune fans don't even really Dune Messiah as a book, like as an actual like narrative, isn't
mhm,
like a lot of them don't really think it's very strong.
mhm.
Um, and that it really feels like the whole reason it was written, and in part this is correct, because Frank Herbert really wanted to drive the point home of,
Yeah,
no, this is Paul is a bad guy. He
yeah,
fucking this, and like it's almost comic because like the opening within like the first few chapters of Doom Messiah, he's like, yeah, so 61 billion people are fucking dead.
yeah,
It's like, oh, like super over the top.
yeah,
Yeah, so it does kind of feel very wonky in that regard. To your point, from an intellectual, like
yeah,
conceptual view,
yeah,
but from like an actual narrative, even like Dune
yeah,
fans are like the novels are kind of like, they're kind of like too
yeah.
dense.
The themes of Dune, when I read about them, seem more interesting to me than when we actually like experience them moment to moment.
That's a great
And
way to put it.
maybe that's inherent to the book, which I know I've read part of it, and it's weird. It's a very weird book, in both in terms of the subject and the way it's told.
Dude,
And I wonder if that's hard to convey in a movie like this.
dude, I gave Lord of the Rings shit for doing that thing where it was like, oh, later in the narrative that you introduce other shit that like
Hmm.
comes out of nowhere. Dune
Yeah,
is like the worst,
yeah,
especially after, well, Messiah has a lot of that too, but
yeah,
particularly the others children and God Emperor, and
yeah,
they just, um or Chapter House. That was the last one.
Yeah,
Or of Frank's anyway. Um, that is another one where they just keep adding just like tons
yeah,
of shit. Like there are like spoilers for anyone watching, but like Duncan Idaho, Jason Momoa's character in
yeah,
uh the first one,
yeah, yeah.
and again, kind of as a critique, his death was a very important moment for Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is like, oh, this is the moment where like, oh, shit's on.
Yeah, yeah.
But then in Messiah, he gets resurrected as like a Gola. I think it's Gola. I think it's pronounced. Where it's like kind of a like it's them but not them. But then later he
Yeah.
gets his memory. Like it's so weird.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's like even like fans are like, yeah, read the first two and
Yeah,
see how
yeah.
you feel, and then if
Yeah.
you're vibing with it, then maybe go to the others.
Again.
But as like a full, to your point, as like ironically, I won't go too much into it, but ironically, I would argue that Frank's later works, particularly Children and particularly God Emperor of Dune, they kind of are contradictory to the point
Mm-hmm.
he was trying to make in Dune.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want me to go into it, but it's just like it's
I've watched a YouTube video summarizing
it's
the entire series, so
they're
I'm familiar
very
with it.
okay. So they're very weird, where it's like, yeah, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad,
Yeah.
but actually, it's like, wait a
Yeah.
minute, hold on. I almost thought that when I first like read up on it, it's like I almost thought that like Brian, that's why people didn't like him, because later
Mm-hmm.
he changed the story. It's like, no, that was Frank. And I'm like,
No, yeah.
oh, that actually kind of is weird.
Well,
It's
one of the things I thought was I thought the point of the movie wasn't necessarily that Paul being the Messiah was like an evil act. It was more so I thought about like the helplessness of omnipotence. And I thought
yes,
that was a very interesting thing that the film did, that like Paul kind of doesn't have a choice in doing this. Like,
he does not.
yes, this is going to be bad, but everything else is going to be worse. And I found that element very interesting. I just wish they would have hit it a little bit more. I
Yeah,
felt like Paul's story in the film, they don't really do a good job kind of emphasizing this point. He just kind of drinks the water of life, and it's just like, oh, I'm the. He has kind of a little bit of a vision, but it doesn't really last long enough for me. I was like, I would have had that be really trippy and weird.
yes,
And by the way, I didn't finish it, but I was watching Dune 1984, the
which is yeah,
yeah, Lynch's version, and it's weird, but I do kind of appreciate that the weirdness kind of complements Dune a little bit
absolutely,
more than like Villanova's great. Don't get me wrong. Like the cinematography is really really good in this film. It's clean. It's evocative. It feels like the perfect modern adaptation of Dune. Like that
yes,
fits the cinematic landscape we're in right now. He knocked it out of the park. Fantastic. I don't think anyone could have done a better job with that. But Lynch, for all the weird awkwardness of that film, and that film was bad. I didn't finish it, but I was watching it. It's like, it's weird and kind of cringy at times, but the weirdness kind of made it stand out a little bit more. When he's got these weird, like poorly edited visions, it's awkward and stuff, but it's like you get the sense that something trippy is really happening here. And I think Dennis could have hit that a little bit more with Paul's transformation.
absolutely. I think that is one of the big um a pretty big issue in Dune Part Two is like, and I understand that like to the film's defense, because they changed Chani's character, the scene where Paul arrives at the meeting and he's sort of like it, Chani almost becomes sort of like in a sense the POV character for the last act, and I think that they do it really well, but it does because you could argue it's like, well, Paul he stops really becoming Paul. And oh, so that to your point, that is a great point, and just how much it kind of contrasts with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a story about how if you, no matter who you are, you can make the choice to do something good. You can, if even if you're like a bad person or you make a mistake, you can change course. Personal autonomy is very important to that story. Dune is the antithesis, where at the end it's basically like, and yeah, and I think that was where it's like it's not even like um a bad guys wins kind of story. It's not even like a, evil triumphs over good. It's like none of this shit matters. And that's almost like, to me, that almost is more horrifying. It's almost more of like this existential dread of like none of like all of this, like we've been building up this story and like the fathers and sons and battles and revenge, yada yada yada. And in the end, it's just we're all just pawns and we have no control over our actions.
I think that's definitely, I think, what I was going for.
And again, to your point, I understand like thematically, that's really interesting, but actually seeing it play out, because even like that's sort of like the issue where when you're watching the movie, you do kind of get caught up in it. It is kind of satisfying, like the final fight between Paul and Feyd is like fucking badass. It's awesome. And then to kind of to see him, my favorite, where like I literally went like fuck yeah, was when in the first movie, the space leader, space bitch, I don't remember her name. She did the voice on him, and she's like silence. And then at the end of the second one, he hits her with the silence, and I was like, fuck yeah. But it's ironic because it's this weird balance between you're dealing with a narrative that is very cold and calculated and very distant and existential, but you still kind of want to make it Hollywood. You still want there to kind of be this balance between people you root for. Yeah.
You brought up two things which I want to talk about. Which let's talk about Chani.
Yes.
I've heard you say you're a fan of that change of making her antagonistic towards the idea of Paul being the Messiah.
Hmm.
For me though, I I'm questioning, what does she want? Like, I had a real hard time getting into the idea, like, what is her motivation? Like, yes, like, understand she wants to help her people or whatever, but I don't understand why she's with Paul when she has this non-believer attitude. And you would think that she would dislike Paul as a result and be more of an enemy to him. And I don't know. Making her a non-believer for me it made her just kind of feel a little wishy-washy. I don't quite get what her purpose is then.
So yeah, so in the book, it's a little bit strange where she kind of it's sort of weird in the book where it's like for Chani, she's kind of the same where she kind of doesn't buy into the whole Messiah thing, but then it's more of a thing where um uh after Paul sort of like decides to take on the role of Messiah, she kind of still, it's weird, like it's like, oh well, she like buys into it too. It's like not really. She kind of still knows it's bullshit,
Hmm.
but she loves Paul.
Yeah.
And she's kind of like, yeah, I know that, but like, it's cool.
Yeah.
It's so her character in the book, in a like, one of the just reasons I like to change anyway is the fact that like she's much more of a character than she is in the book. A lot of people
Mm,
like defend book Chani, but like she's very not interesting at all.
mm,
Um, another, so yeah, so to one point, the reason I think that she loves Paul, or the tragedy of the story, is the fact that when Paul, and they portray this, I think, very well in the film, is that when Paul comes to the Fremen, it is very clear. Oh, actually, this is another change from the book. Um, in the book, um, and this kind of goes along with this very like cold, calculated view of you know, warfare or like politics. Duke Leto,
hmm
in the book, his him his respect of the Fremen, or him, uh, his characterization, he's a lot more calculating. He's a lot
hmm
more. He's kind
I've
of
heard that.
similar. He's kind of similar to the Hark. Well, not like as bad, but like everything he does has a very clear political goal. He's very politically
He's
minded.
not as heroic as he's portrayed in part one.
Yes. And yet, what the reason that it works so well in part in the movie is that because, and Oscar Isaac is perfectly cast because he's so fucking likable,
Hmm.
is that we really like his character. And he even says to Paul, it's like, even no matter who, even if you're only my son, that would be enough. It's a very
Yeah.
like touching moment. And so when Paul goes to the Fremen, you can tell that Paul is he's very respectful of their ways.
Hmm.
He's extremely like he wants to
Yeah.
know their language. He wants to gain their trust the right way. He's not trying to work them. And this
Hmm.
goes well with, I think in the book, Jessica doesn't actually become the Reverend Mother until a little bit later.
Mm.
Um, well, in the book too, there's like a 2-year time jump.
Yeah.
So like when part 2 picks up, Chani has already had a child with Paul. Another good choice they made, because that was
Hmm.
kind of weird. It just kind of fucks a lot of shit up. Well, actually, in the book, it's the death of his son that kind of pushes. I would actually agree that's another sort of issue in the movie where his decision to finally drink the water of life, I don't
Yeah.
think is developed. There's the scene where
Yeah.
he um, sees the ghost of Jamis, which is a
Yeah.
touching moment, but it did kind of feel like where in the book it's the death of his son where he
Yeah. It's
realized
more powerful. It's more of a
yes,
character thing.
yes. Um, oh, so yeah, so in the movie, Paul, you can really tell that he's like very respectful of the Fremen, and that is
Yeah.
why he doesn't want to buy into the Messiah. I'm like, I don't want to fuck with these people. I
Yeah. Yeah.
respect them. These are my friends. But then when he reconciles that he has to, that's what makes it so
Yeah.
much more heartbreaking.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
Chani, I think the reason for the movie or like what is going on is that she knows the real Paul. She knows that this isn't you. You're not someone
Hmm.
who's trying to work us. You're not someone who's you don't believe in this Messiah shit. You
Yeah.
want to gain our trust naturally. But then when he shows up in the theater, she's like, "Who the fuck is this guy?" But
Yeah.
difficult because she still loves him.
Yeah. Hmm.
I will say that as weird as the 2-year time jump is in the book, it. Hey babe, sorry, my girlfriend's got home.
It's fine.
Uh, it in the movie, it does feel a little rushed. I think
They
they
don't. It doesn't give enough time for them to really feel like these two are like bonded together.
yes, I do think I think very similar to like Lord of the Rings. I think they did the best with what they could,
Yeah.
and it's again like it's more sort of like implied. But I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
like, again to your point, the fact that she would decide to still stick by. Well, I guess depending, we'll see how Messiah because the
Yeah. Yeah.
ending of the book where she leaves is completely different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it did seem a little weird that like the fact that she's so down. Well,
Yeah.
actually, spoiler for people, one of the theories and one that I actually like is that at the end of Dune Part 2, Chani kind of has forsaken Paul. She kind of has
Mm.
realized this is not the man that I love.
Yeah.
But a lot of people think that at the end of Part 2, she's pregnant. And that is what's
Mm.
going to bring her back. So it really isn't so
Ah.
much of oh, I love Paul, though. It's more of
Yeah.
I have a child and I want the the father to be in his life.
Yeah.
So if they go that route, I actually think that will work better.
It'll be
Um,
interesting.
yeah, but I agree with you where it's like, um, even though it is kind of wonky in the book, trying to streamline it in the movie does kind of
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
it. And this sort of was an issue I have with Lord of the Rings, where it's sort of like there are certain beats that are kind of like insisted as
Yeah.
opposed to it
Yeah.
unfolding naturally. It's like, okay, they love each other now, just kind of like buy it.
You can tell it's from the source material, and they
Yeah.
just have to kind of go with it. One change that I absolutely think they should have done is, and I don't care how this affects from the book or whatever, they should have introduced like Feyd, Austin Butler's character,
Hmm.
in part one. And I really think he should have just been the only other Harkonnen besides the Baron. I think the nephew or whatever in part one, played by the guy from
Robin, Dave Bautista.
the guy from
Yeah.
Guardians of the Galaxy, pointless character. I don't know why he's involved in this film at all. I get it's from the book or whatever. I understand that, but like there really should have been some kind of rivalry with Paul to make that final fight impactful, because that's the first time they meet. And it's like these two characters have never had interaction before. This guy's not even really done anything to the Fremen. I mean, yes, he attacks them at the very end, which forces him to the south, but like I really think this guy should have been Paul's main Harkonnen rival throughout the series, throughout the two films, and it would have made this ending more impactful. And again, I get that it's from the book, but I think that's a big misstep for me.
I completely agree. I think that having Fade and Robin sort of be like a what's the word I'm looking for, a composite character, I
Yeah,
think that would have been completely fine. I think that probably would have been better.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, so again to the point in the book, um, Fade is sort of like a strange character in the book where he's sort of I don't want to like use this as well to one extent. In the book, there's a whole other sort of like mini political subplot with the Harkonnens where Robin and Feyd and like
Yeah.
the Barons like kind of playing them against each other.
Yeah,
So it is
yeah.
interesting. And so you almost kind of like feel, I don't want to say like you feel like, because again, they're fucking psychos, but like the worst people alive.
No,
Um,
I do feel like they gave Fade whatever positive characterization the Harkonnens could possibly have. I think they did give it to Fade a little bit. I don't think it was nearly developed enough. This should have been introduced a lot earlier, but they did set up that like he's almost like the antithesis to Paul. Like he is another possible chosen one that the Bene Gesserits are interested in.
yes.
And he's got some level of like honor. I don't know how much of it there is. Again, if he'd been introduced in part one, we could have developed that more. But there is a sense that like there's something to this guy that's more than just a rabid psycho like Raban is. It's like there's something here. There's that thing he has with the Bene Gesserit girl. Um, this could have been an interesting character, a non one dimensional character, but it just wasn't enough time for him to get that.
And to you're spot on, because in the book he kind of I mean like he's still like a bad guy obviously,
Yeah, of
but
course,
he
yeah,
kind of almost is more of like a weird like sort of like an anti-hero character in a
yeah.
sense, where he sort of is like, because they explain more about like again I don't want to use that example, but like he's kind of like the Neville Longbottom to Timothy Chalamet's like Harry Potter, where there's
I
like,
could see that.
yeah, it's
I
like,
know
oh, he's the
exactly what you're
chosen
saying.
one, but there's almost like, oh no, there's, and it almost kind of deconstructs this idea of the chosen one, where it's
Yeah.
like, well, how can he be the chosen one if there are multiple people who can
Mm-hmm.
fill the prophecy? And it
Yeah.
kind of does sort of like deconstruct, okay, what is actually, what are we talking about, destiny or fate? What are we talking
And
about?
it might just be me projecting this, but when they talked about the fact that he could be the chosen one, I was almost thinking to myself that like as evil as the Harkonnens are, and even as evil as Fate is himself, maybe him being the chosen one would be better than Paul, because as much of a psycho as he is, he's not going to lead this jihad that's going to burn half the universe apart. It's like I thought that might just be me projecting, but it
No,
felt
that's
like
fair.
it tied into the narrative of like the the evilness of the chosen one or whatever, the evilness of the Messiah. It's like maybe if someone evil like Fade was the one, it could be better. And again, maybe and I would have had that fight with Paul had a real impact because you're like, maybe this is the better fate if he dies here. But I just again, if they had just introduced him in part one and developed him all the way through, I it would have been really impactful.
Well, it's funny because, like, that's a good point in this in terms of like when we're talking about morality systems. What if we're talking about sort of like utilitarianism or whatever? What if, so like, yeah, so what if I were to give you an example of like, so like Paul is like the nicer, kinder, more gentle person, where Fade's kind of like a psycho and he murders people. But then you would tell, so like, oh, so who should be the chosen one? It's like, well, you would think, well, Paul, because he's he seems like it. But what if I were to tell you, through no just circumstances out of their control, that if Paul takes control, things are going to get like 50 times worse? It's like, so now the question is like, okay, so, well, what's the correct answer? What is the moral thing to do? And that's sort of like what the book and movies, or particularly like Frank Herbert's view is, where it's like this idea of heroes and villains and good guys and bad guys. It's like, it can matter in like sort of like the very like minute, minuscule, like atom level, but when you step back and look at the vastness of the universe, this shit means nothing. Because, hey, like a perfect example is like, you know hey, there's a child about to be killed and you save the child and you're a hero, and then the child becomes Hitler. So are you a hero still? It's like, well, are you? It's like, well, it depends on the scope of your perception. So that's kind of what Frank Herbert's. But again, to your point, I think conceptually, it's funny now that you point that out. I think Dune itself is almost like more, I almost like talking about it more than like experiencing it. It's like, it's sort of like that sort of thing.
My observation of the fandom too is that it's a lot like that. I think a lot of people like the ideas of Dune more
Mhm.
than the actual moment to moment, word by word experience of Dune. And I mean, maybe you could even say the same thing about Lord of the Rings. I think that there's definitely a dedicated book following that's out there. But I think a lot of people, when they read Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, more so Hobbit, they're more like the movie, the cinematic experience is a little bit more like epic at times and more satisfactory than some of the moment to moment storytelling. Like
Mhm.
for a famous example, Lord of the Rings has Tom Bombadil. It's this really weird chapter where the hobbits meet this random little character who's like kind of like a god, but he's like a goofy little leprechaun thing. And what the truth behind it is that Tolkien, it was Tom Bombadil was like a doll that his kids had, and he wrote it into the story because he was essentially writing these books for his family and his kids, and they just happened to become this huge worldwide phenomenon. But there's little weird things like that in the books where it's just like it's good they left that out of the movie. It's like it doesn't really make sense when we're appreciating it as like epic fantasy, but again, it was important to the author, so he put it in there.
It's funny too because you mentioned, oh yeah, so Fade is more of a he's more of like kind of like an anti-hero in the book where he's
Mhm.
like you kind of again he's a psycho, but like you kind of like it's like well you said I was the chosen one and you
Yeah.
promised me all this shit and then you kind of like I kind of like lost in the end. That sucks. Funny enough, originally, so you know the final battle between Fade and Paul
Mhm.
originally because Paul was supposed to be born a girl,
Mhm.
but Jessica you know,
Yeah.
that chose not to out of love
Yeah.
for Duke. Um, um, I think the original plan. I'm pretty sure this is true. I
To
have to
have them
double
marry,
check
right?
to have them marry. So it's so
Yeah.
like holy shit. It's so
Yeah.
and like it brings up this whole idea of like um oh he is the chosen one. It's like
Mhm.
no this is the antithesis of that. He is a
Yeah.
anomaly in a way. Um, So, yeah, and again, it's
I
thematically
mhm.
you hit the nail on the head. Thematically, I think Dune is, like, way more interesting than
Yeah.
necessarily the A to B storytelling.
Yeah. I will say the thing I loved the most about these movies was Jessica. I found her the most engaging character throughout the whole thing because it felt like she actually had plans that were moving. And they were, I mean, they were bad plans in the sense that it's going to hurt a lot of people, but she's actively moving towards it and she's moving towards the event and she's manipulating stuff. And I found her to be the most engaging performance. And I really love the actress. I thought she did a fantastic job with it.
Rebecca Ferguson is just fucking amazing, dude.
Yeah.
Um, I would even funny enough, I think one of the critiques of it, would say because it kind of comes down to perception where it's like and this isn't a critique of Rebecca Ferguson's performance, but I almost wonder if it's Denis Villeneuve's direction where there were times when I did feel like Jessica was framed as a little bit too like too evil minded, too sort of like yeah.
Hmm.
A good comparison. Have you seen or read Watchmen?
I've seen the original Watchmen movie. Yeah.
Okay, so if you take a character like Doctor Manhattan,
Hmm.
who's like an omnipotent being, and like his entire point is like he doesn't give a shit about like little
Yeah.
human matters because he knows it's insignificant.
Yeah.
But he isn't an evil character. His tone
Hmm.
isn't like conspiring or conniving. It's almost hmm, like it's just a very
Yeah.
detached. It's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
and there were a couple times where, and again, I understand. I think, and this is why I put it on Denis. I and particularly because of how the book was received initially, I do think that he kind of used Jessica to kind of as like a tool to tell the audience like, hey, this is like a bad thing. This whole thing, this whole she's a manipulator. She's manipulating the Fremen, which she is. But there were a couple times where I almost felt like they're framing it as if like she's like and it's like
Yeah. Like
it's not really what's going. Again, like Paul, she's just playing her role.
yeah.
She's just I understand that like, and that's what's even weird too, where it's like to go back to Lord of the Rings. See now I'm like getting into it. I'm sorry. Um, when we talk about like personal autonomy and choices, and when we're talking, and then when we go to Dune, and to your original point about the characters being sort of thin, that is kind of a a point of the novel in the sense that like, well, who are you? What are you if
Yeah.
you are stripped of your autonomy? It's like if
Yeah.
all the choices you make are like you're just kind of a computer at that point. You're just kind
Yeah.
of you're just a input X outcome Y. You're not even like what makes us human in a sense is our ability to or our perceived ability
Yeah.
to be able to make choices and change our destiny.
Yeah.
Well, what if that was just null and void?
Yeah.
And so it's almost like the ending is almost more of like an existential horror take
Yeah.
on the Chosen One
I
story.
think it
Yeah.
absolutely is. I think that again, that critique of the genre, I thought was very interesting. Um,
Maybe a bit too much though. It's like it kind of did seem like, even like rewatching it, I'm like, this does feel like a very big fuck you to like Tolkien esque narratives in a way.
it felt more heavy handed. By the way, is
Yeah,
his name Denis, not Dennis?
I'm pretty sure it's Denis Villeneuve.
Okay,
I
I've been calling him Dennis.
That's fine. I think it's.
I'm gonna call him Dennis. I'm gonna call him Dennis the Menace.
I'm sure. I'm sure we're all butchering it to some extent.
Yeah.
So.
Anyway, what I was gonna say though is the message felt a little more heavy handed in this version than it did in the 1984 version.
Mhm.
And again, I didn't finish it, so I can't definitively state or not, but it felt like, man, they really want to hit you with this thing that like religion is bad and manipulating people's. And again, I'm like, fair point. That is the point of the film, but um, I almost wonder if maybe he hits it a little bit too hard at times. Like it could be a little bit more ambiguous, and then maybe the narrative would have been a little richer rather than felt like it's kind of like it felt a little bit like The Wire to me, in the sense that like they really want you, the message is more important than the characters.
Yeah.
And I do love The Wire, don't get me wrong, but it felt like it was kind of going for more like we're not that interested in the character moments per se, as like this theme is really important and we want to show it to you.
That's a good point. Very fair point. And it's funny because fuck, what were we just talking about? Um, you can cut this part out. I'm having like a brain fart.
No, I'm leaving this in here when you're struggling.
Damn it! You just mentioned something about I had like a brain fart. It's happen.
About
It
him
happens.
hitting the point hard.
Yeah, it happens when I work at the bar, and I like, it's like because like you go at one point during the bar, like when it's like super busy, you're kind of like on autopilot, and I look up and I'm like, whoa. Oh, sorry. So you could argue, and this is sort of like on one hand, I understand Vinny's uh point, but on the other hand, I'm almost like maybe it did go a little bit too far. I understand that the changes that Denis made were in order to avoid the fate of what happened with when Doom was originally published, where people kind of like viewed it as like the message went over their head. However, there are some parts in Dune 2 where I'm almost like I almost wonder if you're hitting the nail too hard, as you put it. You're almost you can reel back just a little bit. You don't
You're almost
have to.
preaching at this point.
Yes. And again, it's like I understand, well, I really wanna make the point. It's like and like, are there plenty are there going to be plenty of people who miss the point? Obviously, but maybe we shouldn't cater to them
No,
specifically.
I think that like again, you're gonna ruin the narrative a little bit when you focus too much. And even The Wire did it a little bit better in the sense that yes, it was very it hit its message very hard, but it also really showed it to you. And
Mhm.
again, maybe all my problems will be solved when Dune Messiah comes out. I will watch it. Maybe when I see the impact that Paul's jihad is gonna have, then I'll feel a lot of the stuff a little bit more. But for my final thought as we wrap up here, we're about at our time here, is that like, and again, we've been saying this a bunch of times, but I get it, I understand it intellectually, but I didn't feel it, and I wanted, and I appreciate feeling stuff in media more than thinking about it. So did not hate Dune. Let me get that straight. I didn't hate it. I'm not negative towards it. Anyone who loves it, I get it. It's a well made film. I think it is, like I said, as perfect of an adaptation as you could get for the modern cinema landscape that we're in right now. I think there's a level of realism that is expected of modern films where you can't do like the Lynch version of all the weird psycho bullshit in that film. Like it was so fucking
But
weird.
you know, it's so funny that you put that though, because what something that really so a perfect example, there's sort of I don't really know what it's called, but there's sort of like an arrogance we humans have about so for example, if we were to say in almost every single there are some funny enough, Arrival by Denis is goes against this, but it's really funny when we think about like aliens. Anytime we think of aliens, we think of like beings that are pretty similar to us as humans.
Hmm.
They're humanoids, or they can like they have eyes or they have arms. Whereas when you just look at like our planet, like the amount of different organisms and animals on our planet, it's almost like arrogant of us to think that like if we find aliens out there, why would you even possibly think they're going to look anything like even resemble us? There's even a theory out there that like maybe we have found alien life out there. We literally just can't comprehend it.
Hmm.
And to some extent, to give it credit, I do think that Lynch's Dune, kind of plays into that, where it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, no, in like 10,000 years, shit would be weird. Like it's like
Yeah.
it's as much as I do like the Dune adaptations, to your point, it's very like grounded and makes it relatable, but it almost like looks too similar to like
Yeah.
modern day. This looks like it's like maybe like 100 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dune's admittedly looks like it's like this is
It looks
10,000
fucking
years in the
weird.
future. Yes.
I don't want to get into this whole thing real, but I just like want like a one sense from you. Do you know anything about what's it called, Jarkovsky's Dune or whatever? Because people keep talking
Oh,
about this,
Jodorowsky's, yeah.
and what I've come to understand about it, it was like an adaptation that was going to happen, and people
Mhm.
are kind of like speculating about what it could have be, and they've like kind of hyped it up in their minds to this, it was going to be the most incredible adaptation of all time.
Yeah, I would look. I think there are a couple documentaries on it, or like just info. It's very, very. It's like it was a nightmare of a pre-production, and it just never material because Dune in and of itself was always viewed as because to your point, because of how much it sort of like relied on ideas and sort of like thematic, weight, the it didn't really translate to the screen, and so
Yeah.
that's why for X amount of decades, 6 decades now, it's always been viewed as sort of like an unfilmable novel, which it technically is, unless you change it significantly
Hmm.
in certain areas. Which to me is probably this is probably going to be the what's I'm looking for, definitive
Yeah.
adaptation of it.
Yeah.
However, I will say that I am excited for Messiah specifically because it's very likely that Denis isn't going to follow
I've
the
heard
plot.
that. Yeah.
He's probably going to combine Messiah and elements of Children of Dune, which is the fourth novel.
Yeah.
Not God Emperor. That one is very, very weird.
Yeah.
That one is very weird. But he's probably gonna. I think Messiah is going to be um, not, I don't want to say unrecognizable, but it's going to deviate heavily from the source. It's going to be sort of like an amalgamation. Ironically, though, a lot of Dune fans are fine with that because they're like, to your point about like the Lord of the Rings and the book purists and the movies, a lot of fans are like, yeah, Messiah was kind of trash.
Yeah.
Like, again, thematically,
Yeah.
Messiah we understand, but the actual plot of Messiah and
Yeah.
that's kind of fucking weird. So actually, Denis, go ahead, change a lot,
Yeah.
do your thing. So
I think we should be more comfortable in general with adaptations changing stuff.
yes,
Now, it has to be done for the right reasons. You can't go into it thinking that like, oh, it's too slow or whatever, so we have to make it more action oriented or whatever. That's a bad way to go into it.
yes,
But if there is something that you think you could translate better, or the characters could be richer as a result, I think you can and you should do that. And I understand it's very hard because I'm sure Denny got this a lot. I'm sure the book purists were like, you change this one fucking line, fuck you, you're a
yeah, but
hack.
like
They always get that shit, so I
you're always gonna
understand
get
it's,
people, yeah.
yeah. So I was, like I said, didn't vibe with it completely, but I was happy with it, and I will watch Messiah, and I think he did a good job overall. So we're done with our time here. I know I kind of build this as like this was going to be controversial, but I actually think we do what we always do, which is we're both very respectful and very
Yeah,
moderate in our takes, which might not be the best idea. Maybe we should go harder. Maybe we should go like, yeah, now fuck Dune, you're a pleb if you like that shit. Fuck Lord of the Rings.
I'm just gonna tweet Lord of the Rings was woke, and then just
Yeah,
turn my Twitter off and just hope. Although ironically,
people do say that.
finally,
Some people say that.
well, funny enough, and I feel like I should know this, and I feel like I do know this. I may have just forgotten. Was Eowyn's line, "I am the man," was that in the books?
My instinct is to say it's not. I don't remember 100%.
Okay, because I barely remember them thinking, like, I think because I saw some people like complain about it, like this is like woke trash even back in
Oh, people did
2003.
complain about it even back then. They did.
But then I think, so I think this is why I think someone mentioned, she may not say those exact words, but it, she said something like, "And no man am I," or something like that. So like, oh, so Tolkien, that was what he was going. So if you want to call woke, you gotta call Tolkien woke, and it's like, now we're getting
Well,
to it.
I always thought it was kind of, and maybe I'm just projecting this again too, but I always thought it was kind of Shakespearean. It reminded me of Macbeth, the
Hmm.
idea that like I cannot be killed by any man who's been born, and it turns out the guy who kills him was born of a C-section. So it's like it kind of related to Shakespeare for me, and I think Tolkien might have been going for that, but
That makes
who
sense.
fucking
And
knows?
funny enough that you bring that up, and just this might actually, and again, I think this is like, this is where we're like, we kind of just like, where there's certain things for certain, like, I'm not saying that Lord of the Rings is like bad. I have my issues, but like, I recognize it's like, this is just not a story really for me that doesn't really touch on my sensibilities. Shakespeare has always been like that for me. I think that the plots of Shakespeare are kind of cool, the stories, but the actual like plotting, like the way A to B and like the characters and like motivations and how it just never resonated with me. I always really disliked it. So
I could see that. Anyway, that's our episode here. If you guys want one of these sick ass shirts, go check it out. I'll cut back and forth between the two of us right now.
nice.
But yeah, it'll be linked in the description or in the description, and I'll post in the pinned comment. Order your own shirts. You can have drip like us, and stay tuned for the next episode of No One's a Critic coming soon.
Take care, y'all.